On their wedding night, he lost control, and she, young and innocent, discovered a feeling she never knew existed. What began with doubt turned into a beautiful love. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because the ending will leave you breathless. Emma's hands trembled as she adjusted the lace veil over her dark hair, facing the mirror in the most luxurious room of the inn that rose majestically before Nantucket Sound. The glass returned an image she barely recognized. A bride dressed in white, with eyes shining with an emotion she couldn't name. Was it fear, resignation, or something deeper that she refused to admit? The scent of roses drifted through the half-open window, mingling with the aroma of the hydrangeas that decorated every corner of the suite. Outside, the Massachusetts sun descended slowly toward the horizon, painting the sky in golden and pink tones that seemed brushed by the hand of a celestial artist. The murmur of the waves arrived like a constant melody, a reminder that the world kept turning even though she felt time had stopped. Emma closed her eyes for a moment. 3 months. Only 3 months had passed since her life had taken an unexpected turn at that 4th of July celebration in Stowe, when fate decided to intervene with the subtlety of a hurricane. She remembered the exact moment clearly. The sound of the brass band, the smell of barbecue and apple pie, the laughter of children running between the red, white, and blue decorations. And then he appeared. James Thornton. The name resonated in her mind like the echo of an ancient bell. To all of New England, he was the man who had built an empire from nothing, the businessman whose boutique inns stretched from the Green Mountains of Vermont to the coast of Maine. To her, until that moment, he was simply the stranger her father had chosen to save the family from financial ruin. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Emma, sweetheart, are you ready?" Her mother's voice, Linda, crossed through the wood with the softness of someone who knows all too well the weight of sacrifices. Emma took a deep breath before answering. "Just a moment, Mum." She looked at herself once more in the mirror. The veil had belonged to her grandmother Grace, and before her to generations of women in her family who had walked to the altar with hearts divided between duty and desire. It was an inheritance that weighed more than the delicate lace, a tradition that tied her to a past she hadn't chosen, but that now defined her future. The small inn in Stowe, that colonial house inherited from 3 generations, had been the home of her childhood dreams. The wraparound porches where hot cocoa was served on snowy mornings, the maple trees that blazed red and gold in autumn, the aroma of her grandmother's blueberry muffins in the kitchen. All of it had been about to be lost, devoured by debts her father hadn't known how to manage, and by a crisis that had struck small family businesses hard. And then James arrived, with his impossible-to-refuse proposal. Emma opened the door and found her mother waiting with moist eyes. Linda wore an elegant navy blue ensemble, but there was something in her gaze that transcended protocol, a mixture of pride and sadness, of hope and guilt. "You look beautiful," she whispered, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "Your grandmother would be so proud." Emma felt a lump in her throat. Grandmother Grace had passed away 2 years ago, but her presence still permeated every corner of the inn. Every recipe kept in yellowed notebooks, every story told by the fireplace on winter nights. "Mum," she began, but the words stuck in her chest. "I know, sweetheart," Linda squeezed her hands tightly. "I know this isn't what you dreamed of, but sometimes life takes us down paths we don't choose, and on those paths we find exactly what we needed." Emma wanted to believe her. She wanted with all her strength to cling to that hope her mother offered like a lifeline in the middle of the ocean. But when she thought of James, of his distant gaze and rare smile, she found only uncertainty. The months of engagement had been an exercise in empty courtesy. The formal meetings, the Sunday brunches at the family home where he observed everything in silence, the walks through the streets of Stowe, where words seemed to escape them. Emma had tried to cross that invisible barrier he maintained, but every attempt crashed against a wall of ice that seemed unbreakable. "It's time," said Linda, offering her the bouquet of white and red roses. Emma nodded and walked toward the door that would lead her to the rest of her life. Outside, a black car waited to take her to the small stone chapel on the outskirts of Nantucket, where James awaited by the altar. The ocean sparkled in the distance, a silent witness to a union the world saw as a contract and that she feared would never be anything more. But fate, capricious as always, had other plans. The chapel of St. Mary's rose on a hill overlooking the harbour, its grey stone walls gleaming under the afternoon sun, as if guarding centuries-old secrets. Red and white roses decorated each dark wooden pew, and the scent of incense mingled with the sea breeze that entered through the colonial windows. Emma walked down the aisle on her father's arm, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. Robert Sullivan, a man with broad shoulders and hands weathered by years of work at the inn, maintained his composure with the dignity of someone who had learned to hide his weaknesses. But Emma knew all too well the subtle tremors of his fingers, the tension in his jaw. She knew he also carried the guilt of this situation. At the back of the chapel, beside the minister dressed in white, James waited. Tall, with angular features and dark hair combed back, he wore an impeccable grey suit that accentuated his aristocratic bearing. His eyes, a deep green like the calm waters of the Sound, fixed on Emma when she began to advance. And then, for a fleeting instant, she noticed something different. It was just a blink, a shadow that crossed his gaze before he recovered his impassive expression. But Emma saw it, something that looked dangerously like fragility, hidden beneath layers of invisible armor. The ancient organ filled the space with notes that vibrated in the chest, and when Emma reached the altar, James extended his hand to receive hers. The contact was electric, unexpected. His fingers were cold but firm, and for the first time Emma noticed the small scars that marked his knuckles, scars that told stories she didn't know. "You look beautiful," he murmured, so low that only she could hear. It wasn't an empty compliment. There was something in his voice, a rough texture that Emma hadn't perceived before, as if the words cost him more than he let on. The ceremony passed like a dream from which she was a spectator. The minister's words, the vows pronounced with trembling voices, the exchange of rings that sealed a pact neither had desired, but both had accepted. When the moment for the kiss came, James leaned toward her with a gentleness that surprised her. His lips barely brushed Emma's, a contact as brief as a whispered promise, and in that instant she perceived the scent of his cologne mixed with something else, something that smelled of loneliness. The exit from the chapel was greeted by a shower of rose petals that the guests threw while applauding. The sun was beginning to set, casting elongated shadows over the cobblestone path leading to the cars. Emma smiled mechanically, conscious of the cameras and expectations, but her mind was elsewhere. Who really was the man who now wore her ring? During the months of engagement, she had learned the basic facts. James Thornton, 38 years old, owner of the Thornton Hospitality Group, one of the most successful businessmen in New England. But behind the headlines and photographs in business magazines, there was a void that no one seemed able to fill. The historic mansion where the reception would be held appeared before them as if taken from an old tale. The white clapboard walls gleamed under the golden light of dusk, and the windows with their black shutters revealed an interior decorated with flowers and candles. The sound of a string quartet already drifted from the garden, where the musicians tuned their instruments for the first waltz. Emma descended from the car and felt the sea breeze caress her face. James appeared at her side, offering his arm with the same distant courtesy that had characterized all their encounters. "Ready?" he asked. She looked at him, searching for something beyond the mask, but the green eyes remained impenetrable. "Ready," she answered, though she wasn't sure for what. The reception was intimate, as he had requested. Only 50 guests, mostly Emma's relatives and some of James's business associates. The quartet played soft melodies while the servers offered New England clam chowder, lobster rolls, and glasses of champagne. The aroma of flowers mingled with that of the sea and the freshly cut grass, creating an olfactory symphony that was pure Massachusetts. Emma watched her mother, who was trying to contain her tears while talking with a distant cousin. Her father, who was drinking more whiskey than advisable and avoiding her eyes. Her maternal grandmother's sister, who observed her from a corner with an expression she couldn't decipher. And she watched James, who seemed like a stranger in the middle of a celebration that was as much his as hers. He remained standing near the window, holding a glass of champagne he had barely tasted. His gaze wandered around the room without settling on anything in particular, as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. When his eyes met Emma's, she again perceived that fleeting shadow, that flash of something he struggled to hide. "It's time for the first dance," announced the master of ceremonies. The quartet changed rhythm, and the notes of a romantic melody filled the space. James walked toward Emma and offered her his hand. "May I have this dance?" he asked, with a formality that seemed out of place at his own wedding. Emma accepted. When he took her in his arms, she felt the rigidity of his body, the tension contained in every muscle. They danced like two strangers forced to share a space too small, maintaining an invisible distance that neither dared to cross. "James," she whispered as they slowly turned. "Why me?" The question had been stored for months, and now it escaped without permission. He looked at her, and for a second the mask seemed to crack. "Because you needed help," he answered. "And because I needed, something." "Something?" He didn't answer. The music continued, and they kept dancing under the guests' gazes, two people united by a contract and separated by an abyss that seemed insurmountable. But Emma would always remember that moment, that infinitesimal pause before he looked away, that something that remained floating in the air like a question without an answer. Because in that instant, without knowing it, she had begun to glimpse the truth that James hid with such care. 2 weeks before the wedding, fate had placed before Emma a revelation that would change everything. It had been a rainy afternoon in Boston, one of those autumn storms that seemed to wash the cobblestone streets and wrap the city in beautiful melancholy. Emma had accompanied James to his central office, a brownstone building that overlooked a square where the public garden could be seen in the distance, illuminated by sporadic rays of sun between the clouds. He had left her in a conference room while he attended an urgent call, and she, bored of waiting, had begun to explore. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just curiosity, the innocent desire to better know the man with whom she would share her life. James's office was sober, almost austere. Dark wood furniture, shelves full of books on architecture and hospitality, and an antique desk that seemed to have witnessed decades of important decisions. On it, among piles of documents and folders, rested a rusted metal box that caught her attention. Emma looked toward the door. James's voice came muffled from the hallway, discussing numbers and deadlines. With her heart beating faster than it should, she opened the box. Inside were photographs, some old in black and white, showing a building that looked like an orphanage, with children lined up under the gaze of nuns in dark habits. Others were more recent, landscapes of small Maine towns wrapped in fog and green mountains, and underneath everything, a letter. The paper was yellowed by time, the edges worn as if someone had read and reread it countless times. The handwriting was shaky, irregular, written by a hand that trembled with emotion or age. "My dear son, if you ever read these words, I want you to know that there wasn't a single day when I didn't think of you. Every sunrise, every sunset, every star in the night sky reminded me of your face, the one I barely saw before they took you from my arms. I was so young, so scared. I had nothing to offer you except a life of misery and shame. Your grandfather would never have accepted your existence, and I didn't have the strength to face him. I did what I believed was best for you, even though it meant destroying myself inside. I left you at the orphanage in Chicago, hoping you would find a family that could give you what I couldn't, a family that would love you as you deserved, that would give you a name and a home. But every night when silence fell over my room, I cried for the son I had lost. If you ever find me, I don't know if I'll have the courage to look you in the eyes. But I want you to know one thing. I loved you. I loved you from the moment I knew you existed, and I will love you until the last breath of my life. Forgive me, my son. Forgive this cowardly woman who failed you when you needed her most. With all my love, Margaret." Emma's hands trembled when she finished reading. The sound of rain hitting the windows seemed to amplify, filling the silence with a sad melody that resonated with the words of that letter. James had been abandoned. The man the world saw as cold and calculating, the businessman who had built an empire with his own hands, carried a wound that no success could heal. Emma felt the ground shift beneath her feet, felt everything she thought she knew about him crumble like a sandcastle before the tide. Carefully she placed the letter back in its place and closed the box. When James returned minutes later, she was sitting exactly where he had left her, leafing through a decorating magazine without really seeing it. "Everything okay?" he asked, with that distant courtesy that now seemed like necessary armor. "Everything's fine," she lied, "but nothing would ever be the same. That letter had opened a door that Emma didn't know if she should cross, but could no longer ignore. Now she saw James with different eyes. Every silence, every evasive glance, every invisible barrier took on new meaning. It wasn't coldness he was hiding. It was pain. A pain so deep that he had learned to bury it under layers of success and control, building an empire to prove he deserved to exist in a world that had rejected him from the first day. And Emma, without knowing how or why, felt something inside her beginning to change. The inn rose majestically before Nantucket Sound, its white shingle walls gleaming under the light of the full moon. It was one of the most exclusive establishments in James's chain, and the bridal suite occupied the entire top floor, with panoramic views spanning from the harbor to the distant lighthouse. When Emma and James entered, the silence between them was dense as the fog that sometimes covered Cape Cod. The luggage had already been arranged by the staff, and on the sitting room table waited a bottle of champagne, alongside a bouquet of white roses. Everything was perfectly organized, as befitted the hotel of a man who left nothing to chance. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her heart racing. The wedding dress had already been changed for a simpler outfit, but her grandmother's veil rested on a chair, a silent reminder of everything this night meant. James walked to the balcony. The sea breeze gently stirred the linen curtains, and the lights of the town sparkled in the distance like fallen stars on the water. He remained with his back turned, a dark silhouette outlined against the night sky, and the silence stretched between them like an impossible ocean to cross. Emma watched his back, remembering the letter she had found. That woman's words resonated in her mind. "I left you at the orphanage in Chicago. Forgive this cowardly woman?" How many nights had he spent looking at the horizon, wondering why he had been abandoned? How many times had he built walls around himself so no one could hurt him again? The minutes passed, marked only by the sound of waves breaking against the rocks. Emma didn't know what to do, what to say. She had expected something. A conversation, perhaps. An explanation of what their life together would be like. But James remained motionless, as if he had forgotten she was there. That's when she heard it. A muffled sound, almost imperceptible. A contained sob escaping despite all efforts to silence it. James was crying. Emma rose slowly, her bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. Each step toward the balcony seemed to last an eternity, and her heart beat with a force that thundered in her ears. She didn't know what she would find, but something propelled her forward, a force she couldn't name. When she touched his shoulder, she felt his entire body shudder beneath her fingers, a tremor that ran through every muscle, every fiber of that man the world believed invincible. James turned, and Emma saw for the first time the human being behind the mask. The green eyes were reddened, the face marked by furrows of tears that gleamed under the moonlight. There was no coldness in his gaze, no distance, no barriers, only a pain so ancient and so deep it seemed to swallow him whole. "James," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. He looked away, as if the shame were worse than the pain. "You should go to sleep," he said with a hoarse voice. "Tonight I can't, I'm not going anywhere." The words came out before Emma could think them. But when she heard them in the air, she knew they were true. Whatever contract united them, in that moment there was something more, something that transcended agreements and conveniences. She moved closer, until she could feel the warmth of his body, despite the cool breeze. Gently, she took his hand in hers. His fingers were freezing, trembling slightly. "Tell me," she asked, "whatever is tormenting you, tell me." James looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the battle he waged with himself. Decades of silence, of carefully constructed walls, of secrets kept under lock and key. How could he trust someone he barely knew, a woman who had married him out of obligation? But perhaps it was precisely that which made him yield, the fact that Emma had nothing to gain from his vulnerability, that she was there not because she loved him, but because something inside her prevented her from leaving him alone with his pain. "Do you know why I married you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because my father needed help," she answered, "and because you needed something." James sketched a bitter smile. "I needed a family." The words hung in the salty air. Emma waited, feeling that confession was just the beginning. "I never had one," he continued, looking at the sea. "I grew up in an orphanage in Chicago. The winter nights were so cold, we slept huddled together to keep from freezing. The days were long, full of chores and prayers and the hope that someone someday would come for us. Emma squeezed his hand tighter. But no one came, he said. Years passed, and the other children found families, but not me. Maybe I was too quiet, too strange, or maybe I simply wasn't meant to be loved. James, when I turned 18, they put me out of the orphanage. I had nothing. No money, no education, no last name that meant anything. I started working on fishing boats off the Maine coast, hauling lobster traps under the freezing rain. Then I found work at an inn in Portland, cleaning rooms. I learned everything I could, saved every penny, and swore that someday I would have something of my own, something no one could take from me. Emma listened, feeling each word was a brick he removed from his wall. The scent of the sea mingled with the night, and the stars shone above them like silent witnesses. I built this empire, James continued, to prove I deserved to exist. Every inn, every business, every success was proof that I was worth something, even if no one had wanted me. But inside, his voice broke, and tears began to flow again. Inside, I was still that boy waiting by the orphanage window, watching the others leave with their new families while he stayed behind. Emma felt something break inside her. A barrier she didn't even know existed crumbled, and in its place arose an emotion she couldn't name. A tenderness so intense, it was almost painful. I found my mother, he said then, and his voice became a whisper. Years ago. She lives in a small town in Montana, but I never had the courage to go see her. Why? James finally looked her in the eyes. Because I'm afraid she'll reject me again. And in that moment, under the full moon bathing the Massachusetts coast, Emma understood something fundamental. That man wasn't cold or distant. He was a wounded child who had learned to survive by hiding from the world. Without thinking, she hugged him. She wrapped her arms around him and held him while he trembled, while decades of repressed pain finally found an outlet. The waves broke below. The wind whispered through the beach grass, and two strangers who had been forced to unite discovered that, perhaps, they weren't such strangers after all. That night, there wasn't what Emma had expected. There was something infinitely more intimate. There was truth. There was vulnerability. There was the beginning of something neither had planned, but that both, without knowing it, had been waiting for their whole lives. The weeks following the wedding night brought subtle but significant changes. Like the first flowers blooming after a long winter, the relationship between Emma and James began to transform in ways neither had anticipated. He started coming home earlier. At first, Emma barely noticed. She was accustomed to the prolonged absences, to the solitary dinners in the dining room of their new residence in Nantucket, to the nights waiting for the sound of the door announcing his return. But little by little, the schedules changed. Meetings ended earlier, business trips shortened, and then the hydrangeas began. The first appeared one October afternoon when Emma returned from visiting her mother in Stowe. On the entryway table rested a vase with vibrant blue flowers like the sunset over the Sound. A note accompanied the gift, written in James's precise handwriting. "I saw these in the inn's garden and remembered you mentioned them once." Emma stood looking at the flowers for long minutes, her heart beating with an emotion she didn't know how to interpret. It was true. Weeks before, during one of their formal encounters before the wedding, she had mentioned in passing that hydrangeas reminded her of her grandmother Grace, who cultivated them in the garden of the inn. He had remembered. From that day on, flowers began appearing regularly, sometimes hydrangeas, other times roses or lilies, always accompanied by brief notes, almost shy, as if James didn't know exactly how to express what he felt, but was determined to try. Emma also noticed other changes. During dinners, he began to talk more, not about business or numbers, but about small things. Fragmentary memories of his childhood in the orphanage, anecdotes from the early years working in inns, dreams he had had and never shared with anyone. One night, while they shared a bottle of Napa Valley wine on the terrace, he told her about the stars. "At the orphanage," he said, looking at the night sky, "the windows were so dirty you could barely see through them. But there was one, in the second-floor hallway, that someone had cleaned. I would sneak out at night to look at the stars from there. It was the only time I felt at peace." Emma moved closer to him, letting her shoulder brush his. "What did you see when you looked at the stars?" "Possibilities," he answered softly. "Each star was a different world, a place where maybe things could be different, where I could be someone." "And you are," she said. "You're someone extraordinary, James." He looked at her, and in his green eyes there was something Emma hadn't seen before, a warmth beginning to melt the ice that had protected him for so many years. "No one ever told me that before," he whispered. She smiled. "Then I'll have to tell you more often." The visits to the inns became a shared routine. James invited her to accompany him on his tours of the chain's properties, and Emma discovered a world that until then had seemed foreign to her. She learned about New England architecture, about the importance of details in hospitality, about the delicate balance between tradition and innovation that defined James's style. But the most revealing were the moments when he interacted with the staff. Far from being the distant and cold boss she had imagined, James knew every employee's name, asked about their families, remembered important dates. There was a humanity in him that the business world didn't see, a generosity he reserved for those who worked beside him. "Why do you never show this side of yourself?" she asked him one day, while they walked through the gardens of an inn in Bar Harbor. James stopped beside a stone fountain, the sound of water creating a soft melody. "Because vulnerability is seen as weakness," he answered, "and in the world I move in, the weak are devoured." "But you're not alone in that world," said Emma, taking his hand. "Now you have me." He looked at her with an intensity that made her shiver. "Really?" he asked, and there was something of a frightened child in his voice. "Do you really have me?" Emma didn't know what to answer. That question held more than words could express. Did she have him? Were they building something real, or was it still just a convenient arrangement that time would dilute? But as she looked into his green eyes, as she felt the warmth of his hand in hers, she knew one thing for certain. Something was changing, something that went far beyond what she had imagined when she accepted that impossible marriage. The walks through the streets of Stowe became a Sunday tradition. They walked together through the village streets, stopping for hot cider and apple pie at the cafes Emma had frequented since childhood. He listened while she told him stories of her childhood, of the afternoons playing in the inn's garden, of the nights when her grandmother taught her to cook traditional recipes, and little by little, without either of them planning it, they began to build something that looked dangerously like a home. The Stowe Inn was the project that united them definitively. James proposed renovating it, transforming it into a small boutique inn that would honor family tradition while incorporating modern comforts. Emma resisted at first, fearful of losing the essence of that place that meant so much to her. "I don't want it to become just another property in your chain," she told him one afternoon, while they reviewed the plans in the maple-lined garden. James shook his head. "It won't be part of the group," he promised. "It will be yours, completely yours. I just want to help you make it survive." And so began the transformation. They worked together for months, supervising every detail. The colonial porches were restored with respect. The original fireplaces were preserved. The gardens bloomed once again. But modern bathrooms were also added, a small professional kitchen, comfortable rooms that maintained the original charm. It was a labor of love. And in that work, Emma and James discovered they shared more than they had imagined, a vision of the world, a respect for the past, a desire to build something that would transcend their own lives. The night the inn reopened its doors, Emma cried. Not from sadness, but from something that felt like joy mixed with relief. She was standing in the garden, looking at the stars through the maples that climbed the walls, when she felt James's arms wrap around her. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," she answered, leaning back against his chest. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like everything is going to be fine." He held her tighter, and she felt his heartbeat against her back, a constant, secure rhythm that promised something neither of them yet dared to name. Thanksgiving in Boston arrived with the smell of roasted turkey and the sound of the Macy's parade on every television. The streets filled with families bundled in warm coats, with decorated shop windows, and the anticipation of the holiday season. Emma and James had decided to spend those days in the city, staying at one of the chain's inns that occupied a historic brownstone in Beacon Hill. From the bay window of their room, they could watch the bustle of Charles Street, the quintessential New England charm mixed with the excitement of the holidays. It was the night before Thanksgiving when everything changed. They were having dinner at a small restaurant near the Common when Emma noticed James stiffen. His gaze had fixed on something or someone across the room, and his face had lost all color. "James," she asked, touching his hand, "what's wrong?" He didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on a point Emma couldn't identify. When she turned her head to follow his gaze, she saw an elderly woman sitting alone at a corner table. She had white hair pulled back in a bun, a face furrowed with deep wrinkles, and was dressed in black like so many other women of her generation. But there was something about her, something in the shape of her eyes, in the curve of her jaw, that was disturbingly familiar. "James," Emma insisted, "who is that woman?" "My mother," he whispered, and his voice sounded as if it came from very far away. "That's Margaret, my mother." Emma felt the world stop. The woman from the letter, the one who had abandoned him at the orphanage in Chicago more than 3 decades ago, the one he had searched for and found, but never had the courage to face. And now she was there, just a few meters away, completely unaware of the earthquake her presence had triggered. James stood up abruptly, almost knocking over the table. "We have to go," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "But James—" "Now, Emma, please." She didn't argue. She left money on the table and followed him to the street, where he walked aimlessly for several minutes, fists clenched, breathing ragged. Holiday shoppers passed by them. Carolers sang on the corner, but James saw nothing. Finally, he stopped in a deserted alley, away from the holiday bustle. He leaned against a brick wall and closed his eyes, as if trying to contain something that threatened to overflow. Emma approached slowly, not knowing what to say. Words seemed insufficient before the pain emanating from him like heat waves on an August day. "I didn't know she would come," he said finally. "I don't understand what she's doing here. She lives in Montana. Why is she in Boston?" "Maybe," Emma hesitated, "maybe she's also looking for you." James let out a bitter laugh. "After 36 years, now she decides she wants to know me? You don't know. You don't know why she's here, and I don't want to know." But Emma saw the contradiction in his eyes, desire and fear fighting for control. The abandoned child who kept waiting by the orphanage window, and the man who had built walls to protect himself from more rejection. The following weeks were difficult. James closed up like a hedgehog, returning to the long work hours, to the silences Emma thought they had overcome. He arrived late, left early, avoided any conversation that might approach the subject of Margaret. Emma tried to be patient. She remembered the wedding night, when he had lowered all his defenses. She knew that beneath that renewed armor still existed the man who had cried in her arms, but getting through the wall was increasingly difficult. One night, after a particularly silent dinner, she decided to confront him. "You can't keep going on like this," she said, standing in the doorway of his study. James looked up from the papers he was pretending to review. "Like what?" "Running. Shutting down. Acting like nothing happened." "Nothing happened. Your mother is in Boston. That's something." He looked away, jaw tense. "She's not my mother. She's a woman who abandoned me." "She's both things," said Emma, approaching. "And until you face it, it will keep tormenting you. I don't need your psychological advice." The words were harsh, cutting, designed to hurt, but Emma didn't back down. "No. What you need is to stop being afraid." "Afraid?" James stood up, his eyes shining with an emotion that could be anger or pain. "You think I don't know what fear is? I lived the first 18 years of my life in fear. Fear of not being enough, of no one wanting me, of every day being the same as the one before. I built all of this so I'd never feel that fear again. And now you come telling me—" "That fear doesn't disappear by ignoring it," she interrupted. "That it's still there, growing in the darkness, until you decide to face it." The silence that followed was dense, charged with electricity. They looked at each other like two adversaries in a duel, but also like two people who had shared something too intimate to pretend it didn't exist. "I don't know how to do it," he admitted finally, and his voice broke. "I don't know how to look at her without feeling like I'm 5 years old again." Emma crossed the distance separating them and took his face between her hands. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "I'm here and I won't let you fall." James looked at her with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. And then, for the first time since that night in the restaurant, he let the tears flow. She held him while he cried. She held him as she had done on the wedding night, as she would do so many times in the future. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that what she felt for him had stopped being compassion or curiosity. It was something much deeper. It was love. Autumn arrived in New England with its ochre and golden colors, the maple leaves falling softly over the cobblestone streets of the historic villages. At the inn in Stowe, the first guests filled the renovated rooms, marveling at the colonial porches and the views of Mount Mansfield. Emma had found renewed purpose in managing the small hotel, applying what she had learned alongside James while preserving the family essence she loved so much. Every morning she prepared breakfast with her grandmother, Grace's recipes, and every night she lit candles in the garden as her mother had done for decades. But Margaret's shadow remained present. James had hired a private investigator to locate her, though he refused to admit it. Emma had discovered it by accident, finding an envelope with detailed reports on the elderly woman's movements. Margaret had returned to her small town in Montana after Thanksgiving, and since then had been living in the same stone house where she had spent the last 40 years, alone, according to the reports, without close family. One November afternoon, while the wind swept dry leaves across the garden, Emma made a decision. "I'm going to write to her," she announced during dinner. James dropped his fork. "What?" "To Margaret. I'm going to write her a letter." "You have no right." "I have every right in the world," she answered calmly. "I'm your wife, and I see you destroying yourself inside every day that passes without resolving this. It doesn't need to be resolved." "Of course it does." Emma extended her hand across the table and touched his. "James, listen to me. I'm not asking you to forgive her. I'm not asking you to pretend that what she did is okay. I'm just asking you to give her the chance to explain herself, for you, so you can close that wound once and for all." He was silent for long minutes. The antique clock in the dining room marked the seconds with its monotonous tick-tock, and outside an owl hooted in the maples. "And if the explanation isn't enough," he asked finally, "what if it only confirms that she never wanted me? Then at least you'll know and you can move on." James looked at her with a mixture of fear and hope that reminded her of the wedding night. "Do you think I'll ever be able to forgive her?" "I think," said Emma, "that forgiveness isn't for her. It's for you. To free yourself from the weight you've been carrying for too long." He nodded slowly, as if every movement cost him immense effort. "Write the letter," he said, "but don't promise her anything." Emma wrote that same night. The words flowed with an honesty that surprised even her. She spoke of James without revealing too much, introducing herself as his wife, explaining that he had found the letter Margaret had left at some point in the past. She asked with delicacy if she would be willing to meet. She demanded nothing, judged nothing, simply opened a door and waited. The answer arrived 2 weeks later. Margaret had written on yellowed paper with the same shaky handwriting as the original letter. Her words were cautious but loaded with emotion. Yes, she wanted to meet her son. She had spent her entire life waiting for that moment, though she never believed it would come. She was willing to travel wherever necessary, to answer all questions, to accept any rejection, if that was what he needed. Emma read the letter aloud, while James remained seated before the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows across his face. "She wants to come," she said when she finished, "but only if you agree." He didn't answer immediately. He watched the fire as if searching for answers in the flames. "I'm scared," he admitted finally. "I know. I'm scared she'll come and discover I don't deserve her time, that she'll look at everything I've built and still see the child she abandoned, that she'll confirm she was right to leave me." Emma knelt before him, taking his hands in hers. "Listen to me, James Thornton. You are the most extraordinary man I've ever known, not because of your ins or your money, but because of your heart. Because of the way you care for the people who work for you, how you've treated me despite the circumstances of our marriage, your ability to keep going when everything told you to give up. If Margaret can't see that, the problem is hers, not yours." He looked at her with shining eyes. "When did you stop being a stranger and become the most important thing in my life?" The question caught her by surprise. She felt her heart skip a beat, felt something inside her expand until it filled her completely. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but I'm glad it happened." James leaned toward her and kissed her. It wasn't a shy brush like at the altar, but a real kiss, deep, charged with everything they had built during those months. When they separated, both were breathless. "Tell her to come," he murmured against her lips. "Tell her I'm ready." Emma smiled, feeling tears threatening to spring forth. "Are you sure?" "With you by my side," he said, "I'm sure of everything." The appointed day dawned grey, with low clouds covering the sky over Stowe like a velvet mantle. Emma had prepared the inn for the visit, choosing the coziest room with views of the mountains and the white church steeple rising majestically in the distance. James hadn't slept. She had heard him pacing through the house during the night, the creaking of his steps on the hardwood floor marking the hours of insomnia. When she saw him that morning, she noticed the deep circles under his eyes, the pallor of his face, the almost imperceptible tremor of his hands. "You can still cancel," she reminded him while preparing coffee. "No," he answered. "If I cancel now, I won't have the courage to try again." Margaret arrived shortly after noon. The sound of a car stopping on the gravel driveway made James tense like a guitar string about to snap. Emma squeezed his hand one last time before walking to the door. The woman who stepped out of the taxi was smaller than she had seemed in the Boston restaurant, fragile, almost ethereal, with white hair gleaming under the grey light of day. She was dressed in black, as always, but carried in her hands a package wrapped in tissue paper that she held as if it were a treasure. "Emma?" she asked, and her voice trembled like autumn leaves. "Yes, you must be Margaret. Welcome to our home." Margaret looked at the inn with eyes that seemed to search for something beyond the walls. Her face reflected an emotion so intense that Emma felt her chest tighten. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "He lives here. My son lives here." Emma guided her inside, to the room where James waited. When she opened the door, the silence filling the space was almost palpable. He stood by the window looking at the mountains, his back rigid as a marble statue. "James," Emma said softly, "your mother is here." He didn't move immediately. The seconds stretched like years, and Emma could feel the tension vibrating in the air. Finally, slowly, James turned. The meeting of their gazes was devastating. Margaret let out a sob that seemed to have been contained for decades, raising her hands to her mouth as if trying to silence herself. James remained motionless, his face converted into a mask that revealed nothing. "You look just like your father," Margaret whispered through tears. "The same eyes, the same way of standing, as if you carried the world on your shoulders." "I never knew my father," he answered, and his voice sounded strangely flat. "I know. He died before you were born. An accident at the steel mill. That's why I had to leave you. I had nothing. My family had disowned me." "I don't need excuses," James interrupted. "What I need to know is why you never came back, why you let me grow up believing no one wanted me." Margaret took a step forward, then another, until she stood just a few feet from him. "Because I was ashamed," she said, tears flowing freely down her wrinkled cheeks. "Because every year that passed made it harder to return. I told myself you'd be better off without a mother who had abandoned you, that you would have found a family who truly loved you. But I never stopped thinking about you, never, not a single day. How can I believe you?" She offered him the package she carried in her hands. "This is yours. I've kept it all these years." James took it with trembling hands. He carefully unwrapped the tissue paper, revealing a small blanket woven in blue and white wool, worn by time, but carefully preserved. "I wrapped you in it the day you were born," Margaret explained. "It was the only thing of value I had. When I left you at the orphanage, I wanted to leave it with you, but I couldn't. I needed it to remember that you had existed, that it hadn't been a dream." James stared at the blanket, as if it were an object from another world. Emma saw how something broke inside him, how the walls he had built throughout his life began to crumble brick by brick. "All these years," he murmured. "All these years," Margaret repeated. "I carried you in my heart. And when I learned you were looking for me, when I received the letter from your wife, I felt life was giving me a second chance I didn't deserve." James raised his gaze to her. The tears he had contained finally sprang forth, running down his cheeks like rivers, finally finding their course. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice broken. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Margaret answered. "I'm just asking you to let me know you, to let me see who you've become, to allow me to be part of your life, even if from a distance." The silence that followed was different from before, less tense, more expectant. Emma watched from the threshold, not daring to intervene in that moment that didn't belong to her. It was James who took the first step, literally, He advanced toward Margaret, still holding the blue and white blanket, and when he stood before her, he did something none of those present expected. He hugged her. It was an awkward embrace, hesitant as if he had forgotten how to do it. But Margaret wrapped her fragile arms around him and held him as if she wanted to make up for all the hugs she had never given him. And while mother and son cried together in that room overlooking the mountains, Emma knew something fundamental had changed. It wasn't the end of the pain. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. But it was a beginning, a door that finally opened after decades of being closed. The days following the encounter were uncharted territory for everyone. Margaret had settled into one of the inn's rooms, a small but cozy space overlooking the gardens. Emma saw her walking through the hallways with a mixture of wonder and melancholy, touching the walls as if wanting to absorb the essence of the place where her son lived. James, for his part, oscillated between openness and withdrawal. There were moments when he sat with Margaret on the porch, listening to her talk about her life in Montana, about the hard years after leaving him, about the nights when she looked at the sky, wondering if he was also looking at the same stars. And there were other moments when he shut down, when he took refuge in work or in long solitary walks through the village streets. Emma learned to navigate those turbulent waters with patience and tact. She didn't pressure, didn't judge, simply remained present. And little by little, like the thaw of a glacier, the tensions began to ease. One afternoon, while she prepared her grandmother's apple pie in the kitchen, Margaret approached timidly. "May I help?" she asked. Emma smiled and offered her a knife and cutting board. "Of course. I need you to slice these apples." They worked in silence for a few minutes, the rhythm of the knife on the wood creating a domestic melody that filled the space. "Thank you," Margaret said finally, "for everything you're doing. You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." Margaret set down the knife and turned to her. "You've given me the chance to know my son, to see him happy, to know he found someone who truly loves him." Emma felt warmth rising to her cheeks. "Our marriage started as an arrangement," she admitted. "Neither of us expected—" "Love doesn't ask permission," Margaret interrupted with a sad smile. "I know that better than anyone. I loved James's father with all my soul, even knowing our relationship was doomed from the start. But I don't regret it. That love gave me my son." Emma considered her words. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you live with the weight of what happened?" Margaret lowered her gaze. "I don't know. There are days when I drown in guilt, others when I cling to the hope that I can still do something right. But what I've learned, after so many years, is that the past can't be changed. We can only decide what we do with the present." Emma nodded slowly. Those words resonated with something that had been germinating in her own heart for months, the understanding that life rarely follows the paths we plan, but that on those unexpected detours, we sometimes find exactly what we needed. That night, during dinner, something changed in the family dynamic. James told a story from his early years in hospitality, from when he worked cleaning rooms and dreamed of having his own inn someday. Margaret listened with shining eyes, drinking in every word as if they were drops of water in the desert. "Cleaning rooms," she repeated. "You started that way?" "That and much less," he answered. "Before that, I worked on lobster boats off the Maine coast. I slept in bunkhouses with other workers. I earned barely enough to eat. And now you own all of this." Margaret looked around, taking in the inn with a gesture. "I can't even imagine what you must have gone through." James was silent for a moment. "There were times when I wanted to give up," he admitted. "Nights when I wondered what the point was of keeping on fighting if no one was going to notice. But there was something inside me that refused to give in. A voice telling me I deserved something better." Emma reached her hand under the table and interlaced her fingers with his. "And you were right," she said. "You deserved all of this and more." James looked at her with a tenderness that warmed her heart. "What I deserve most," he answered, "is having found you." Margaret observed the exchange with silent tears rolling down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, but of something more complex. Relief, perhaps. Gratitude. The understanding that her son, despite everything he had suffered, had found happiness. The weeks passed and Margaret's presence at the inn stopped being an anomaly to become part of the daily rhythm. She helped in the kitchen, tended the plants in the garden, knitted in the corner by the fireplace as she had done her whole life. and little by little, the walls between her and James kept yielding. It wasn't a linear process. There were difficult days, arguments that arose from old wounds, silences loaded with resentment. But there was also progress. A shared dinner without tension, a spontaneous laugh at a memory, a walk through the village where they talked about things they had never mentioned before. Emma observed everything with a mixture of hope and caution. She knew complete reconciliation would take time, perhaps years, but she also saw the changes in James. The way his shoulders relaxed when he talked with Margaret, the way his smile, once so scarce, began to appear more frequently. And then, one December morning, Emma discovered something that would change everything. Nausea woke her before dawn. Emma ran to the bathroom with her hand over her mouth, feeling the world spinning around her. When she finally managed to stand, the mirror returned a pale, tired image, but with a gleam in her eyes she hadn't seen before. She knew before confirming it. That ancestral instinct women carry engraved in their souls told her what her mind was slow to process. But still, she bought the test. Still, she waited the longest minutes of her life. Still, she cried when the 2 lines appeared in the little plastic window. She was pregnant. She spent the rest of the morning in a state of happy bewilderment, unable to concentrate on anything. The everyday tasks of the inn seemed distant, insignificant compared to the life growing inside her. She caught herself touching her belly, imagining what was to come, building futures in her mind like sandcastles. But with the joy came uncertainty as well. How would James react? Their marriage had begun as a contract, and although both knew it had evolved into something deeper, they had never explicitly talked about children. Would he be ready for fatherhood? He who had never had a model of what it meant to be a father. Emma decided to wait. She needed to find the right moment, the right words. But keeping that secret proved harder than she had imagined. Every time she looked at James, she felt the truth struggling to escape. And every night, nestled against his back, she dreamed of what their life would be like when the baby arrived. It was Margaret who guessed first. They were alone in the kitchen, preparing pumpkin pie for the guests, when the elderly woman looked at her with those eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. "How far along are you?" she asked without preamble. Emma almost dropped the pan she was holding. I have eyes, dear, and I've seen enough pregnancies in my life to recognize the signs." Margaret smiled softly. "Besides, you have that glow, the one women have when they carry life inside them." Emma felt tears spring to her eyes. "I don't know how to tell James. Are you afraid of his reaction?" "Not exactly. It's just that our marriage was so unusual from the beginning. We never talked about having children. I don't know if he wants—" Margaret set down what she was doing and took Emma's hands in hers. "Listen to me carefully," she said firmly. "My son has spent his whole life believing he didn't deserve to be loved, that no one would want him. But you've proven him wrong. And this baby," she gently touched Emma's belly, "this baby will be the definitive proof that he deserves to have a family." "You think so?" "I know it. Because I see how he looks at you. I see how much he's changed since he met you. James is ready for this, even if he doesn't know it yet himself." Emma nodded, feeling the knot in her chest beginning to loosen. Margaret was right. It was time to stop being afraid. That night, after the last guests retired to their rooms and Margaret went to sleep, Emma led James to the garden. The full moon shone over the maples, and the scent of pine perfumed the cold air. "I have something to tell you," she began, taking his hands. James looked at her with concern. "Is something wrong?" "No." Emma smiled, and emotion caught in her voice. "Something wonderful has happened." She guided his hand to her belly, holding it there with hers. "We're going to have a baby, James." The silence that followed was eternal. Emma saw the information being processed in his eyes, saw it pass from confusion to comprehension, and from comprehension to something that looked like terror. "A baby?" he repeated, as if the words were in a foreign language. "Yes, our baby." James took a step back, releasing her hand. His face had lost all color. "I can't," he murmured. "I don't know how. I never had a father." "How am I going to be one?" Emma felt her heart tighten, but she didn't give in to discouragement. She knew that reaction wasn't rejection, but fear. The same fear that had accompanied him his whole life. "You don't need to know how," she said, approaching him. No one knows how to be a parent until they are one, but you have something many don't. The determination to be better, to give what you never received. What if I fail? What if I'm like... He didn't finish the sentence, but Emma knew what he meant. You won't be like your mother, she said firmly, because you have something she didn't, the ability to choose. And I know you'll choose to be present. You'll choose to love this child with all your heart. James looked at her, and in his green eyes tears glistened. How can you have so much faith in me? Because I know you. I know the man who cries in secret when he sees children playing, who donates money to orphanages without telling anyone, who remembers every employee's name and asks about their families. That man will be an extraordinary father. James closed his eyes, and the tears finally fell. A baby, he whispered, and this time there was wonder in his voice. We're going to have a baby. Emma approached and wrapped him in her arms. Yes, and we're going to do it together. He held her tightly, trembling like a leaf, but no longer from fear. It was something else, something that looked like hope finally found. Winter gave way to spring, and with the first blooms of the crocuses came the most evident changes. Emma's belly was beginning to round softly beneath her cotton dresses, and the inn filled with a different energy. There were more frequent laughs, whispered plans, preparations woven like a net of happy expectations. James had undergone a transformation that surprised everyone who knew him. The distant and reserved businessman had given way to a man who couldn't stop smiling, who cancelled meetings to accompany Emma to doctor's appointments, who spent nights reading books on parenting with the same intensity he once devoted to financial reports. "Did you know babies can hear from the 5th month?" he asked one night without looking up from the book. "We could play music for her." Emma, lying on the sofa with her feet on his lap, smiled. "What kind of music did you have in mind?" "Jazz, of course. Let her learn early what good American music is." "What if she prefers heavy metal?" James pretended to be horrified. "Then we'll have failed as parents." Those moments of lightness were new for both of them. The tension that had marked the first months of their marriage had almost completely disappeared, replaced by an intimacy that grew each day. They shared dreams and fears, memories and hopes, building together the foundation of a family neither had planned, but both longed for. Margaret observed everything from her usual corner by the fireplace, knitting blankets for the baby to come. Her wrinkled hands moved with a dexterity that belied her age, creating color patterns that told silent stories. From time to time she raised her gaze and her eyes met James's, and in those looks there was an understanding that went beyond words. The process of reconciliation between mother and son continued, slow but steady. There were nights when James sat beside Margaret and listened to her stories of Montana in her youth, of the small ranches where she had worked, of the harsh winters and fleeting summers. And there were other nights when he told her about the years at the orphanage, about the dreams he had had, and those he had abandoned, about the long road that had brought him here. "Do you think he would have forgiven me?" Margaret asked one afternoon, referring to James's father. "Do you think he would have understood why I did what I did?" James considered the question for a long moment. "I think," he said finally, "that forgiveness doesn't depend on the dead. It depends on the living, and I'm learning to forgive you." Margaret extended her hand and touched her son's with a tenderness she had waited decades to express. "It's more than I deserve, maybe, but it's what I need, to move forward, to be the father I never had." That conversation marked a turning point. From then on, Margaret's visits stopped being temporary. James proposed that she stay permanently at the inn, in the room she had occupied for months, and that already felt like hers. Margaret accepted with tears in her eyes, unable to express in words what that invitation meant. "A family," she murmured, while Emma hugged her. "After so many years, I finally have a family." The news of the pregnancy also transformed Emma's relationship with her own parents. Robert Sullivan, who had carried the guilt of having forced his daughter into a marriage of convenience, found in the prospect of becoming a grandfather a form of redemption. He visited the inn frequently, helping with repairs and preparations for the baby, working side by side with James as he never had before. "I never thanked you enough," he told him one day, while they both sanded the wood of an antique cradle they had found in the attic, "for saving my family, for making my daughter happy." James stopped sanding and looked at him. "You gave me something priceless," he answered. "You gave me Emma." Robert nodded, his eyes moist. "Take good care of her, and take care of that grandchild on the way." "With my life," James promised. Spring advanced, and with it Emma's pregnancy. The months passed between preparations and expectations, between doctor's visits and nights imagining the future. The room that would be the baby's was decorated in soft colors, with the blankets knitted by Margaret and the furniture restored by Robert and James. It was a space full of love, history, and hope. And in the midst of it all, Emma and James discovered something that surprised them both. That happiness wasn't a destination, but a path, that it was built day by day, with small gestures and big decisions, with forgiveness granted and second chances seized. That what had begun as a contract had transformed into something infinitely more valuable. One May night, sitting in the garden under a sky studded with stars, James raised Emma's hand to his lips. "I've never told you this properly," he murmured. "Told me what?" "That I love you." The words came out with an intensity that made her shiver. "I love you like I never thought I could love anyone. I love you for saving me when I didn't know I needed to be saved. I love you for seeing what was beneath the armor and staying anyway. I love you for giving me a child, a family, a home. I love you, Emma, with everything I am." She felt tears rolling down her cheeks, but did nothing to stop them. "I love you too, James. Since that night in Nantucket, when I saw the man you really were, since then and forever." He kissed her under the stars, with the gentleness of someone who knows they have all the time in the world. And in that kiss there was a promise. The promise of a future both had believed impossible, but that now stretched before them like an illuminated path. Summer arrived with its blazing heat, and with it the final weeks of pregnancy. Emma moved with difficulty through the inn, her belly round and heavy, her feet swollen, but with a smile that never left her lips. James followed her everywhere, attentive to every need, nervous at every small discomfort. "You're driving me crazy," she told him one afternoon as he insisted she rest for the 5th time in an hour. "It's my job to worry. Your job is not to raise my blood pressure with all this fussing." He laughed, a genuine laugh that still surprised her every time she heard it. "All right, but if you need anything, you'll be the first to know. Now go work and leave me in peace." But the calm of those days was interrupted by unexpected news. One morning, while checking the mail, James found a letter that left him pale. It was from a lawyer in Chicago, informing him that the old orphanage where he had grown up was about to be demolished. The building had been abandoned years ago, and now a real estate developer planned to build luxury condominiums in its place. Emma found him sitting in his study, staring at the letter with a vacant expression. "What happened?" she asked, approaching with difficulty. He handed her the letter without saying a word. Emma read it, feeling her heart tighten with each line. "James, I know it shouldn't matter," he said, his voice hoarse. "That place was horrible. I spent the most difficult years of my life there. But it was also your home," she completed. "The only one you knew for a long time." He nodded, unable to speak. Emma sat beside him, holding his hand. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to let them destroy it. Let it disappear along with all the painful memories. But another part what?" James looked at her, and in his eyes there was a determination she recognized. "I want to buy it. I want to transform it into something good. A center for homeless children. A place where they can grow up knowing someone cares about them." Emma felt tears spring to her eyes. "That's a wonderful idea, but it will require a lot of money and time. And with the baby about to be born, we'll make it work," she said firmly. "Together, like everything else." The following weeks were a whirlwind of negotiations and preparations. James met with the developer, with lawyers, with local authorities. The purchase of the building proved more complicated than expected, with bureaucratic obstacles and competing offers that threatened to frustrate his plans. But he didn't give up. With the same determination that had allowed him to build his empire, he fought for that building that represented so much pain and so much hope at the same time. And finally, one August afternoon, he received the news that the sale had closed. The orphanage was his. That night, Emma found him sitting in the garden, looking at the stars with a thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting beside him with effort. About all the children who passed through that place, he answered. About the nights we spent looking out the window, waiting for someone to come for us. I want no child to ever feel that hopelessness again. I want them to know there's a place in the world where they're welcome. Emma rested her head on his shoulder. You'll make it happen. I'm sure of it. He wrapped his arm around her, feeling the baby's movement beneath his hand. Do you know what's most ironic? He said. For years I thought my past was just a burden, something to be ashamed of and hide, but now I realize it's precisely that past that allows me to do this. I understand what those children need, because I was one of them. Your pain has become your greatest strength, said Emma, and you helped me see that. They stayed like that for hours, embracing under the starry sky, talking about the future and about the project that would transform pain into hope. And when they finally went inside, both knew they were about to begin a new chapter. A chapter that wouldn't just change their lives, but the lives of many others. The contractions began one September dawn, when the first autumn rains tapped against the inn's windows. Emma woke James with a squeeze of his hand that pulled him instantly from sleep. It's time, she whispered. What followed was a whirlwind of activity. James, who had mentally rehearsed this moment dozens of times, found himself paralyzed for a few seconds, unable to remember what he should do first. It was Margaret who took control, waking Linda and Robert, who had come to spend the last days of the pregnancy with them, and organizing everything with the efficiency of someone who has lived through enough births not to be carried away by panic. The trip to the hospital in Burlington was endless. Every pothole in the road, every curve in the path seemed designed to increase Emma's anguish. James drove with white knuckles on the steering wheel, murmuring words of encouragement he wasn't sure she could hear. We're almost there, he repeated. We're almost there. The hours in the hospital were the longest of his life. Emma walked through the hallways, sat down, stood up, breathed following the nurse's instructions. James remained at her side, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her brow, feeling completely useless and absolutely indispensable at the same time. I can't do this anymore, Emma moaned at one point, the contractions coming with an intensity that left her breathless. Of course you can, he answered, looking into her eyes. You're the strongest woman I know. You can do this and much more. She nodded, finding in his gaze the strength she needed. The birth came with the dawn. The sun was rising over the green mountains when a baby's cry filled the room, a sound James would never forget. He stood paralyzed, tears running down his cheeks, unable to process what was happening. It's a girl, announced the nurse, placing the newborn on Emma's chest. A beautiful little girl. James approached with trembling steps. He looked at that small being, with closed eyes and clenched fists, and felt the whole world reduced to this moment, to this room, to these two people who were now his reason for existing. She's perfect, he whispered, touching with his finger the tiny hand of his daughter. She's absolutely perfect. Emma smiled through exhaustion, tears mixing with sweat. Do you want to hold her? She asked. James hesitated. He had never held a baby in his life, but when the nurse placed the girl in his arms, something changed inside him. Something that had been broken for decades finally found a way to heal. Hello, little one, he murmured, looking at that tiny face that was beginning to open its eyes. I'm your father, and I promise you I'll be here, always. No matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets, I will never abandon you. Never. Emma watched him, tears rolling down her cheeks. That man who had come into her life as a stranger, who had been imposed by circumstances, had become her companion, her love, the father of her daughter. And seeing him now, holding the baby with a tenderness that made her heart ache, she knew everything had been worth it. They named her Hope. It was a decision they made together in honor of Emma's grandmother Grace, who had passed away 2 years before, but also as a symbol of everything they had been through. Hope was what Margaret had maintained for decades while dreaming of reuniting with her son. It was what James had secretly kept while building his empire. It was what Emma had found in the arms of a man who had arrived as a stranger and stayed as her destiny. When Margaret entered the room and saw her granddaughter for the first time, she collapsed into a chair, unable to stay on her feet. Tears ran down her wrinkled face as she watched James holding the baby. A family, she whispered, After all, we have a family. James approached her and carefully placed Hope in her arms. "This is your great-granddaughter," he said, "and I want her to know where she came from. I want her to know her story, all of our story." Margaret looked at the baby with eyes full of wonder. "She's beautiful," she murmured. "She's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life." Emma watched the scene from the bed, feeling her heart overflow with a happiness she hadn't believed possible. Her mother and father entered shortly after, filling the room with laughter and tears, with hugs and exclamations. And in the midst of all that loving chaos, she sought James's gaze. He held it for a long moment, transmitting without words everything he felt: gratitude, love, wonder at the twists of fate that had brought them here, and a silent promise that this was just the beginning. Epilogue. 1 year later. The inn in Stowe gleamed under the autumn sun, its white clapboard walls shining as they always had. But there was something different in the atmosphere, a vibrant energy filling every corner of the old colonial house. It was the day of the inauguration of the Hope Center. Emma watched from her bedroom window while the final preparations took place at the old orphanage in Chicago, now transformed into a refuge for homeless children. Through her phone screen, she could see the images James was sending her: the renovated courtyards, the bright rooms, the gardens where children could play. "It's looking beautiful," she said to Margaret, who was knitting in her usual corner. The elderly woman looked up with a smile. "James has always been like that. When he decides to do something, he does it with all his heart." A coo from the crib caught both their attention. Hope, who had just turned 1, was stretching her little arms toward her mother, demanding attention. Emma picked her up, marveling once again at how that small being had transformed their lives. "Do you want to see Daddy?" she asked, showing her the phone screen. The baby let out a giggle upon recognizing James's face, hitting the screen with her chubby little hands. "We're almost ready here," he said through the speaker. "When will you arrive?" "In a few hours. Margaret is staying with Hope until we finish." "Perfect. I'll be waiting. I love you." "I love you too." Emma hung up with a smile that lit up her face. 1 year. It had been 1 year since that wedding night in Nantucket, when an apparently cold man had revealed his vulnerability under the moonlight. 1 year since her life had taken a turn she never could have imagined. Margaret approached and gently touched her arm. "Go in peace, dear. Hope and I will be fine." "Won't we, sweetheart?" The little one responded with another coo, as if she perfectly understood what her great-grandmother was saying. Emma placed a kiss on her daughter's forehead, breathing in that sweet scent only babies possess, that perfume of innocence and infinite possibilities. "I'll be back before dinner," she promised. The journey to Chicago passed through landscapes she knew by memory: the fields stretching to the horizon, the small New England towns perched on hills, the winding roads crossing an ancient land. But this time, the trip had a different meaning. Every mile brought her closer not just to James, but to the culmination of a dream born from the deepest pain. When she arrived at the old orphanage, Emma was breathless. The building, which in old photographs appeared somber and decrepit, had been completely transformed. The walls displayed an immaculate restoration, adorned with colorful murals depicting scenes of nature and play. The gardens, once abandoned, now bloomed with flowers and trees. The windows, those same dirty windows through which a lonely child had looked at the stars, dreaming of another world, gleamed clean under the autumn sun. James was waiting for her at the main entrance, dressed in a grey suit that highlighted his green eyes. But it wasn't the elegance that caught Emma's attention. It was the expression on his face, a mixture of pride, emotion, and something that looked like peace. "What do you think?" he asked, taking her hand. "It's incredible," she whispered, looking around. "It's absolutely incredible." He guided her through the facilities, showing her every detail with the enthusiasm of a child displaying his most precious creation. The individual rooms, designed so each child would have their own space. The library, full of books and cozy reading nooks. The dining hall where long wooden tables waited to fill with laughter and conversation. The central courtyard, with a fountain that sang softly under the sun. "This is where we used to sleep," James said when they reached a room that now functioned as an activity hall. There were 20 beds lined up against the wall. The cold came in through the cracks in the windows. I remember curling up under the blankets and imagining I was somewhere else. anywhere else. Emma squeezed his hand tightly. And now you've turned this place into something completely different. Not just different, he corrected. The opposite. Where there was cold, now there's warmth. Where there was loneliness, now there will be companionship. Where there was despair, his voice broke, now there's hope. She hugged him, feeling how he trembled in her arms. That man the world saw as invincible was still deep down, the child who had dreamed of being loved. And now, finally, he was closing the circle. The inauguration ceremony gathered dozens of people. Local authorities, representatives of child protection organizations, journalists, and above all, the first children who would be welcomed at the center. Emma watched from a corner as James climbed onto the small stage, improvised in the courtyard. 36 years ago, he began, his voice resonating in the space, a boy arrived at this place without a name, without a family, without anything he could call his own. That boy was me. A murmur ran through the audience. Few knew the real story of James Thornton, the businessman who had built an empire, but he had decided it was time to share it. I spent the first 18 years of my life here, he continued. Years of loneliness, of uncertainty, of asking myself every day why no one wanted me. Years in which I learned to survive, but forgot how to live. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes. When I left here, I swore I would never return, that I would leave this place and everything it represented behind. I built my life on the idea that I didn't need anyone, that material success could fill the void I carried inside. But I was wrong. James sought Emma's gaze in the crowd and held it for an eternal instant. Love found me when I least expected it, in the form of an extraordinary woman who saw beyond my walls, in the form of a mother who returned after decades to ask for forgiveness, in the form of a daughter who taught me that the human heart has an infinite capacity to heal. Tears now flowed freely down Emma's cheeks. This center bears my daughter's name, Hope, because that's what I want to offer every child who passes through here. The hope that no matter how their story begins, the ending can be different. The hope that there's always someone willing to believe in them. The hope that love exists, even if it sometimes takes time to find us. James paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper amplified by the microphone. To all the children who will live here, I make a promise. You will never be alone. You will never be forgotten. You will never stop mattering, because each of you deserves exactly what I found. A family, a home, a place to belong. Applause erupted, but Emma barely heard it. She made her way through the crowd until she reached James, and when her arms wrapped around him, she felt him tremble with the intensity of emotion. I'm so proud of you, she whispered against his chest. None of this would have been possible without you, he answered. You saved me, Emma, you saved me from myself. The rest of the day passed among guided tours, interviews, and celebrations. The first children ran through the gardens, exploring their new home with a mixture of caution and joy that squeezed the heart. Emma watched them, imagining what James must have been like at their age, wondering how many of them would find, as he had, their path toward the light. When the sun began to set over Chicago, painting the sky in oranges and purples, James led Emma to a secluded spot in the building. It was a small terrace on the top floor, with views of the city skyline and Lake Michigan gleaming in the distance. This is where I used to come when I needed to escape, he said. I would sit in this very spot and look at the horizon, dreaming of the day I would be free. Emma sat beside him, interlacing her fingers with his. And now, what do you see when you look at the horizon? James took a moment before answering. I see gratitude, he said finally. Gratitude for everything I have. For you, for Hope, for Margaret, for the opportunity to transform this place into something that can change lives. Don't you feel pain anymore when you think about the past? There will always be a part of me that remembers the pain, he admitted, but it no longer defines me. Now it's just a scar, a reminder of what I overcame to get here. Emma rested her head on his shoulder. Do you know what's most beautiful about all of this? What? That our daughter will grow up knowing her father turned his greatest wound into his greatest gift to the world. That's the most valuable lesson you could teach her. James kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair. There's something I want to give you, he said then, pulling a small box from his jacket pocket. Emma looked at him with curiosity as he opened the box, revealing an antique gold ring with a green stone, that sparkled like his eyes. "It was my father's," he explained. "Margaret gave it to me a few months ago. She said he had bought it to give to her on their wedding day, but never had the chance. I want you to have it. James, I know we're already married," he continued, sliding the ring onto her finger. "But that day was a contract. This is different. This is my promise to love you every day for the rest of my life, to build with you a home where our daughter grows up knowing what it means to belong, to keep healing together, to keep growing together, to keep choosing each other no matter what comes." Tears ran down Emma's cheeks as she looked at the ring on her hand. "I don't have words," she whispered. "You don't need words. I just need you to stay here, with me." "With us?" She kissed him, a long and deep kiss that contained everything words couldn't express. When they separated, the sun had disappeared behind the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the Chicago sky. "Look," said James, pointing upward. "The same stars I used to see from the orphanage window when I was a child. What did you see back then? Possibilities. Worlds where things could be different. And now?" James smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "Now I see that the possibilities became reality, that I found that different world, that I'm living it, here, with you." They stayed there for hours, embracing under the blanket of stars, talking about the future and the past, about dreams fulfilled and those still to come. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the center's gardens, mingling with the song of crickets and the distant murmur of the city. When they finally set off on the return to Stowe, the full moon lit the way like a silver blessing. Emma rode with her head resting on James's shoulder, her father's ring gleaming on her hand, her heart overflowing with a happiness that had taken a lifetime to find. When they arrived at the inn, Margaret was waiting in the garden with Hope in her arms. The baby cooed with joy upon seeing her parents, stretching her little arms toward them. James took her, lifting her toward the night sky. "Do you see those stars, little one?" he said. "Your great-grandmother told me once that each star is the soul of someone who loved us. Your great-grandfather is up there watching you. And he's very proud." Margaret approached, tears gleaming in her eyes, and for the first time James hugged her without reservation. An embrace that contained decades of pain and forgiveness, of absence and reunion, of a love that had survived against all odds. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "Thank you for giving me another chance." "Thank you," he answered, "for coming back, for not giving up." Emma watched them, feeling that this moment was the culmination of everything they had been through. 3 generations united under the starry sky of Vermont, each with their own wounds, but all committed to healing, to love, to hope. That night, after putting Hope in her crib, Emma and James sat on the porch of their room, looking at the sea of stars stretching over the green mountains. "Do you remember our wedding night?" he asked. "Like it was yesterday. That night I thought my life was over, that I was condemned to repeat the same cycle of loneliness I had known since childhood. But I was wrong." "What were you wrong about?" "About thinking I was alone. About thinking no one could understand me. About thinking love was something that happened to others, not to me." James looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "You taught me I was wrong about everything." Emma took his face between her hands. "And you taught me that true love isn't the kind that arrives perfect and packaged. It's the kind that's built day by day, with patience, with courage, with the willingness to see the other at their most vulnerable and choose to stay." "Do you regret anything?" he asked. "About how we started, the contract, the circumstances that brought us together?" Emma shook her head. "Not a single thing, because all of it brought us here, to this moment, to this life we've built together." James smiled, that smile that had been so rare at the beginning, and that now lit up every one of Emma's days. "I love you," he said, "more than I ever believed it was possible to love anyone." "And I love you," she answered, "since that night in Nantucket and until the last beat of my heart." They kissed under the stars, 2 people who had begun as strangers united by a contract and who had found in each other exactly what they needed: a home, a family, a love that had been born from the most improbable circumstances and had flourished against all expectations. In the next room, Hope slept peacefully, oblivious to the extraordinary journey that had brought her parents here. But one day she would know the story. She would learn about the yellowed letter, the transformed orphanage, the love that had redeemed generations of pain. And when that day came, she would understand the most important lesson her parents could teach her, that the deepest wounds can become the sources of greatest strength, that forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. That true love isn't found in perfect beginnings, but in the daily decision to choose the other person, to stay, to build together something that transcends circumstances. As the moon reflected over the maple-lined garden, as the scent of pine floated in the night breeze, as a newly formed family rested under the same roof that had sheltered generations of history, the silence of Nantucket Sound seemed to whisper an ancient truth, that the most extraordinary destinies are born from the most improbable circumstances, and that true love, when we finally find it, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds of the soul. In Stowe, in Nantucket, in Chicago, and in all the places where this story had left its mark, the stars shone as silent witnesses to a transformation that had taken decades to complete. And at the center that now bore her name, the children slept with the promise of a different future, with the hope that they too would someday find what James and Emma had found, a love that redeems, a family that heals, a home where they belong, because in the end that was all anyone needed, and they, against all odds, had found it.